So welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome everyone to the first of our fall 2022 speaker series on international investment law and policy. This is the 17th speaker series on investment policy issues for CCSI, which is pretty incredible. I'm extremely grateful for the continued support of Arnold and Porter in enabling this speaker series, and for the particular support of Kabir Dugal and Melita Hodgson for their continued support with this annual speaker series. I'm also really grateful and delighted for our partner for today's session, in particular, the South Center. The South Center's contributions to supporting developing countries in particular in their informed participation in investment law and policy issues is invaluable and unparalleled. And we're so grateful for all of our opportunities to collaborate with Daniel Uribe and his team, with Danish, with Carlos at the South Center, and particularly thrilled and grateful for your partnership on the session today. The idea for this session was born directly from the wonderful paper that Tim Samples and Sebastian Puerta authored, and which is available on our website on the speaker series page. But I will let Tim and Sebastian properly introduce the paper very shortly. We're so honored to have extraordinary discussants for the paper today, who I will also introduce shortly, but really thrilled and honored to have such a wonderful panel. Without any further ado, it's really my absolute distinct pleasure and honor to be joined by Carlos Correa, who's the Executive Director of the South Center. So let me please invite Carlos to say a few opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for your very kind introductory remarks. So we are really pleased to be able to co-organize this event with the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. We really appreciate a lot the work that you have done in relation to the reform of the investment law, and also the support you have provided to developing country delegations in order to improve their capacity to influence the outcomes of the current negotiation on the system. We are very pleased to co-sponsor this meeting on this important subject of transparency in the investment arbitration system. This is an important issue, and we really welcome also the paper was produced by Tim Samples and Sebastian Puerta. Very interesting paper, very interesting use of predictive models in order to make an estimate of what is not reported. The findings or the estimate they have made are quite significant. As you will listen from the authors, they have made an estimate of $186 billion in terms of claims which are not reported, and 15 billion of unreported awards. And these are very significant numbers that show how important and how serious is the issue of non-transparency in the system. But the paper also contains many very interesting, insightful observations. I will just refer to a few of them. The paper says, for instance, that there is a transfer of sovereign power to a semi-private supranational adjudication system, and this is very true, and this is one of the problems. The paper notes that the bilateral investment treaties lead to an intrusion of international law into domestic spheres of governance, and this is very serious. As we know, this has happened in many areas: health, environment, energy, so on and so forth. So many cases in which there has been this intrusion. And the paper also knows that this is very pertinent observation, that there exists a kind of transparency desert, particularly in relation to the case of settlements which are kept secret, and then there is no information whatsoever what the parties have agreed on. So the paper is really very rich. You have made a very important contribution. We are again very thankful for the opportunity to be part of the presentation of the paper in this event. Let me also thank Lisa, let me thank the authors of the paper and the speakers, and we certainly look forward to continue this cooperation with the Center, which is very important for the South Center as an intergovernmental organization, and we look forward for a very productive discussion today. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And one of the reasons I'm so thrilled for this discussion today is particularly the opportunity to use this research and the methodologies you alluded to and that the authors will describe to be able to inform our collective and collaborative support to countries engaging with these policy issues. So thank you again so much, Carlos, for the remarks and South Center for the collaboration. Tim and Sebastian, let me turn it to you to introduce. Tim Samples is Associate Professor of Legal Studies at the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia, and Sebastian Porta is a PhD student in economics at UC Berkeley. So Tim and Sebastian, over to you to give us the teensiest introduction to this paper that everyone should spend much more time reading and reviewing.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you everyone for being here and for your interest in this topic. And that was a very generous introduction that we got from both of you. So that is much appreciated. We're excited to have this dialogue with CCSI, South Center, and really people who are at the epicenter of this topic. Some of the folks on this panel are actually carrying out the very hard work of improving transparency in a really important area of international law. So that's a huge honor. Sebastian and I first started working on this several years ago. Sebastian currently at Berkeley in the PhD program in economics, and I'm still at University of Georgia. But if Sebastian, if you'll flip the slide, the impetus for this project was actually a previous project, a paper, an article titled "Winning and Losing in ISDS." That's in the American Business Law Journal. And in that project, Sebastian and I, while he was still at University of Georgia, we were assessing individual country results in ISDS. We were looking at 20 highly active countries in the system, and we were a bit stunned by how difficult that was to do. It was actually much harder than we would have expected to assess how particular countries are doing in terms of net claims, net awards, and so that prompted us to examine the transparency gap in ISDS, which is essentially an estimate of the unknown activity in ISDS, combining known amounts with unknown amounts to get a feel for overall ISDS activity. And I'll turn it over to Sebastian to discuss our methodology and results.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be talking with you all today. I'll be chatting through a little bit of our quantitative results. This is going to be just a small snapshot of what's in the overall paper, but I hope you all can read the paper and look through the entire methodology section, as well as the appendix that goes over some of the modeling that I do. So the major findings of this paper, as Carlos said, is that the transparency gap in ISDS is, according to our estimates, $186 billion in terms of missing claims and $15 billion in terms of missing awards. Just to put that in perspective, this is like incredibly quantitatively significant in that both of those are about 40% of the sum of all known claims and awards. So if you take all known claims and awards and you sum those up over all the years that we have data from UNCTAD, those two numbers are about 40% of those totals. So it's an incredible amount. Additionally, about 31% or 339 cases are missing claim information, and 39%, 139 concluded cases are missing award information. And lastly, settlements are like the murkiest area for us. So 81% of settled cases have no information whatsoever. So we can't really do much inference when it comes to that. So overall, the big finding of our paper is that this transparency gap in ISDS is non-trivial and persistent. Let me show you some figures to show you exactly what I mean. So these bars are showing you in the dark red the total number of cases in each year from ISDS, and then the lighter red bars are telling you how many cases are missing claims. So as you can see, like there are more cases over time, and accordingly, there are more cases missing claims over time. The dotted line is telling you in each year, if you add up all the cases and you add up all the cases missing claims and you divide those two numbers, what does that proportion look like? So it looks like over time, it's been roughly about 20 to 30% of cases are missing claims. You can create a similar figure for awards, and you have a similar story. More cases and yet more missing awards. So once you do a bunch of predictive modeling that you can read more about in our paper, you can create this graph where the line on the bottom, the darker red dotted line, tells you how many claims, the total amount of claim dollars over time. And then the line that is slightly lighter on top is that previous number plus our estimate of the missing amount of claims. Then if you take the difference between those two, you make this little gap, and that's what we call the transparency gap. So in 2020, we get that $186 billion are missing. Consequently, you can look at the same thing for awards, and you can see that gap grows over time until we get to 2020, and we see $15 billion missing. Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Sebastian. As Sebastian noted, the gap is significant, and it's also persistent over time. We don't see yet the kind of improvement we would hope to see for a system, of course, that adjudicates public interests versus private rights. And we also observe that low transparency likely exacerbates systemic problems and functional outcomes. I think this will be an area to delve into with the panel. We're trying to keep this presentation very brief, and also some of the folks on our panel have, I think, tremendous insights around exactly those issues. We've also found that settlements are especially opaque. Mediation is a newer avenue in this system that is likely similarly opaque and may raise some similar systemic and functional issues. And when I'm referring to functional issues, I'm kind of referring to and systemic problems, examples like the limited impact that precedent has on clear outcomes for both investors and sovereigns in terms of their treaty policies, their policy decisions, and also future tribunals. Even though ISDS, of course, is not a system of binding precedent, obviously tribunals do look to other decisions as influential. The role of third-party financing is a significant issue that probably deserves more research, and I'll let others speak to that even more. And last point here, in the interest of time, bridging the gap is going to be a challenge. The fragmentation of the international investment law system, plus sovereignty, plus varying levels of commitment and interest in the sovereign realm is definitely going to make this a thorny problem to deal with. But I would end on a note of optimism by saying that we expect the next 20 years of ISDS to be more transparent than the last 20 years of ISDS. And as a further note of optimism, people like the folks in this panel are working very hard to make that a reality. Sebastian and I were thrilled to see Diana Rosert on this panel, somebody we've exchanged emails with going back several years about transparency, and really incredibly helpful to us along the way, which speaks very highly of UNCTAD's genuine interest in improving transparency in the sphere. So without further ado, I will put myself on mute.
Thank you so much, Tim and Sebastian. Thank you for that brief presentation, which was fantastic to highlight, to give the highlights, but doesn't do justice to the extraordinary amount of work. So, so we'll just underscore the suggestion that that those joining us read the full paper. As Tim mentioned, we're incredibly privileged to have discussants that are at the epicenter of these issues. Ana Maria Ordóñez Fuentes, who's the director of Colombia's National Agency for Legal Defense of the State, Diana Rossert, who's the Economic Affairs Officer at UNCTAD, and Daniel Uribe, our partner in the program, who's a lead program officer of the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Program at the South Center, each of whom is at the epicenter, but from a different and complementary perspective, from the state's perspective, from institutional perspective, working on advancing transparency, and from a civil society perspective, also in supporting states to understand the trends in this space and to engage. So I'd like to turn to each and ask for some initial reflections before I hope we can have more of a discussion. And to our participants who are joining, the Q&A function should be open if you want to ask questions in the Q&A function in your Zoom. Let me please start with Ana Maria, who again represents the state or is responsible for the state's legal defense for Colombia, and would be really pleased to hear how the findings of the paper both resonate from your perspective, as well as how they affect the preparation and the legal defense for states.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for inviting us to share with you Colombia's experience. It is actually very interesting for us to see how several of the issues that are tackled by the paper have been very important for the decision-making process of how to establish and how to organize Colombia's legal international defense. So we agree with most of the conclusions that are brought in the paper. And I must say that Colombia, as I have always said, came, as you could say, late as a defending state in international disputes. So we did manage to use lessons learned and best practices from other different states. So several of the issues that are raised in this paper that create this transparency gap, we have tried to address them so that this transparency gap is not created regarding Colombia's defense. So Colombia's baseline regarding transparency is that we are fully aware that we defend public interest. So what we do is that we defend our institutional organization to secure that taxpayers' money will not have to be used to pay billionaire awards. That's our baseline. So, and we have identified that the challenge is to maintain the public informed, because the public needs to be assured that their interests are properly defended without compromising the effectiveness of defense strategies, because that's the thing. This is a sophisticated litigation scenario, and we must not forget that. So we have decided, when we decided to organize Colombia's international defense, we decided to tackle or to address three fronts of transparency. The first one is maintaining the public informed of the disputes filed against Colombia. So we always make public the investor, the measures that are challenged, the value of the claim that is claimed against Colombia, and the defense team. The second front that we address regarding transparency, it's allowing third-party intervention in the proceedings, being always very cautious about cost increase, because taxpayers' money, it's always at stake, even when we have to pay the cost of the administrative cost of the arbitration. and also the lawyers' fees and time, of course. And the last point, which is very closely related to what is found in the paper, is that we have made sure that tribunals' decisions are available to the public in each and every one of the 19 investment arbitrations that have been filed against Colombia. So we have managed to agree that the award is public, regardless of the contents of the treaty. We have prevailed on that by negotiating, and that has been very useful for Colombia's defense. And we find that regarding this last point, essentially, one of the reflections I deem to be more important for states relates to the fact that having information as to the amounts that are claimed and awarded in order to determine the outcome of the claim, it's very important for the legitimacy and transparency of the ISDS system, but also for the state that is involved. Because the legitimacy of ISDS is not the only thing that is at stake. It's also the organization of the state internally. So what we have found is that the fact that proceedings and awards are public, it's a matter that is also aimed at improving the country's legal strategy and preventing future claims. And we speak from Colombia's experience, obviously, but we have prevailed and we have been successful in defending very complicated measures that have been taken by Colombian authorities in a legitimate way. And that's we could say that the awards confirm what we are saying. So the fact that we make public those awards is helpful to legitimate our institutionality and to give assurance not only to the public, but the different public officials that are involved in the decision-making process and that have to make difficult decisions. So the fact that the awards are public has also been useful to create, if you could say, some new rules or new red lines that public officials need to be aware of without being scared or entering into the regulatory chill, which is an undesired consequence of these disputes being filed. So what we think is that favoring transparency of awards also upholds the rule of law. And yes, so it is still important to highlight that in scenarios that are different to that of the award, a limited degree of transparency might be desirable also. But in Colombia, we have also identified that sometimes it is important to protect the state's strategies against similar or parallel claims. Say, for example, in Colombia, we have 3 different investors suing the state in relation with measures that have been taken to protect the Páramo de Santurbán. It's the Ecuador decision which is popular. We did not agree that decision to be public, not because we didn't want the public to get to know it. It's because we have 2 other parallel claims and we didn't want the investors to be aware or to be 3 steps ahead regarding the strategy that has been implemented to Colombia. So my point here is that it's not black or white. The state needs to keep some discretion in order to be strategic, because we must not forget that states agreed to debate different measures in very sophisticated scenarios, and investors devote a lot of resources in order to be able to obtain information. So states need always to be aware and try to protect the defense strategies. I would like to address a last point that deals with the systemic reform. And as the paper correctly points out, one of the difficulties in reforming ISDS is the fact that it lacks an institutional structure. However, we would like to share with you that it was very pleasant and satisfactory to see how different states within the exit amendment process, most of the states favored the inclusion of provisions addressed to tackle what one could call, using the paper's terminology, a manifestation of asymmetrical transparency. So it is true that the fact that investors could easily bring claims against states by being financed by third parties without disclosing circumstances that could risk a tribunal's independence or impartiality, or that could impact a potential decision on costs favoring the respondent. Those were crucial to the current debate and the lack of legitimacy of the system. Yet it remained a problem that could be solved by procuring what we are discussing, institutionally backed duties of transparency. And that is what, through the inclusion of Article 14 of the new rules, states attempted to address. So what I want to conclude with is that these states are aware of this transparency gap. There are several ways to address it, and we are trying to do it. And I also wanted to share with you that being transparent and make decisions from tribunals public does not only contribute to accountability, which is one of Colombia's flags. Arbitrators need to be accountable on their decisions, but also it could help states legitimating their systems. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. I think you've underscored the tremendous complexity of your role and also how much is at stake with the system and how information about the claims and awards permeates all of that. Citizens' rights to understand systems that affect them, and with respect to their tax money and how it's being spent, policymakers' understanding of the scope of their regulatory prerogatives and responsibilities, the legal strategy for defending the state, particularly in the face of parallel claims, and how other cases are so important to understand in that respect, and also the legitimacy challenges within the system and how affected they are, or how much how much transparency in the system is important for understanding and supporting some of the or undermining, I should say, actually, some of the increasing legitimacy challenges, including with respect to third-party funders, accountability of arbitrators, and so on. I'm also just noting how you emphasized the state as both the provider of this information and the user of this information. And so all of that adds up to an incredible complexity for your role, but also underscores the importance of the findings of the paper. So thank you so much for that. You also segued perfectly to Diana's role from an institutional perspective. Diana has been working on these issues from a number of different dimensions. Quite importantly, from experience working on UNCTAD's ISDS database, which is trying to provide or does provide the most coherent collection of information that we have. Also, UNCTAD providing support to governments with respect to their investment policy and tracking and supporting some of the institutional developments to enhance transparency. So Diana, I would love to hear your perspectives from any of those roles, all of those roles.
First, two small comments on Sebastian's and Tim's paper. I think they make a very convincing case for more transparency in investment treaty arbitration. They show that it's a structural issue. And the paper also highlights the normative imperative for transparency. And I think that's a very important contribution as well. Aside from your modeling approach, I will talk about that during my couple of minutes. And Director Ordóñez Puentes gave incredibly valuable insight, really, on Colombia's considerations and the strategy for legal defense. And it's really great to hear this from a state perspective as well. When we at UNCTAD work with states, me particularly, I also have a researcher perspective working on these databases and the cases. So that may also affect how I see transparency in ISDS, obviously. I would like to discuss two specific points based on our work at UNCTAD. My first point is that there is actually a good set of public data on ISDS cases and decisions. And my second point is that there is indeed a big transparency gap. So how do these 2 points go together? One of our tasks at UNCTAD is to collect information on investment treaty cases from public sources and bring them together in one database. We call it the ISDS Navigator. There is enough public data to track trends in investment treaty arbitration. There is good data on ISDS cases, and a good number of full texts of ISDS decisions are available. The available ISDS data is also the starting point for Sebastian's and Tim's calculations, so that predictive modeling fills in the gaps on unreported amounts claimed and awarded. So currently our database covers some 1,190 known ISDS cases brought based on bilateral investment treaties and other IAs. It contains information on the amounts claimed in some 800 cases. So this makes about 70% of all known cases. And if we look at the outcomes of concluded cases, more specifically at cases concluded in favor of the investor, we have information on the compensation awarded for almost all of them. I will say maybe one word on settled cases at the end. I hope I have a few more minutes left. So every year we have some 30 or 40 decisions on jurisdiction and merits. They are publicly available. Well, these are the publicly available ones. I'm speaking about the positive things first, right? And then I'll come to the gaps. And they are the primary source for information in our database. So this helps us confirm challenge measures, breaches alleged and found, amounts claimed and awarded. It's really important to have a good picture of what's happening in investment treaty arbitration, because ISDS cases and awards inform investment policy making, and also they inform the broader public. So the public has a stake in this. Our team at UNCTAD publishes statistics on ISDS cases, and we also review ISDS awards. So how many known cases are countries facing, what measures are being challenged, and what direction are arbitral tribunals taking on key issues. So these are some of the questions we try to address. So information on cases and awards provides evidence on the costs of the ISDS regime and the high level of obligations under IAs for states. And this information can drive reform. So this is why transparency is very important also from a policy perspective. It can help governments weigh the pros and cons of engaging in investment treaty reform, and when they take decisions on the future of the IAA regime and the ISDS system. So now I come to point 2. We have good data, but we cannot claim to have a full picture of ISDS activity. So Sebastian and Tim focused on the unknown claims in known cases. They developed a model to estimate this gap. Another transparency gap are the unknown cases. And at UNCTAD, we collected the publicly known ISDS cases, and we always emphasize these are the known cases, and a share of cases remains confidential. So for ICSID, we know the exact number, but for UNCITRAL and other non-ICSID cases, they are included in our database, but we are sure that they are underreported because there is no registry like the ICSID registry for cases under other arbitration rules. and they only become public, and here the credit actually goes out to someone else, due to the proactive research investigations by reporting services, IA reporter, global arbitration review, and other database providers in this area. We are collecting the public information, but we are not investigating in that sense. And to dig out these unknown cases or make them public, you actually have to spend a lot of time researching and calling up people and making freedom of information requests and so on. And so now I'm running out of time, so I will just say we have this issue with decisions for known cases, which are sometimes also missing, and the new amended exit rules may, to a certain extent, close that gap, but we'll still have that big problem for decisions outside of exit. We are missing details for a large share of settled cases, and we are missing other documents such as notices of arbitration in many cases. So, and when I say we, I mean this collectively. This information is missing, it's not publicly available. There has been some progress, but overall this transparency gap persists, and I think this is in line also with the findings of the paper.
Thank you so much. And I hope we have more time to pick up on some of the things that you've raised, but your points are also a perfect segue to hear from our last discussant before opening the floor. Daniel has been at the heart of policy-oriented research to support stage engagement with these reform processes, including the institutional negotiations that you referenced briefly, Dan. As you mentioned, transparency is a bit more well-established in the ICSID system, but at UNCITRAL, it remains largely elusive. UNCITRAL is also the home to the largest right now multinational negotiation over ISDS reform, where Daniel and his team have been absolutely leading on our and supporting states to engage within the negotiation. So Danielle, I hope you can share any and all perspectives around how this transparency gap affects your work, affects your research, affects how you support states, and affects how we should think about and engage with the UNCITRAL reform process.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you very much, Diana, Ana Maria, Sebastian, and team. Your presentations were really good and encompasses a lot of what we had in mind when we were discussing about our participation as South Center in this meeting. I actually want to start with my concluding parts because they're actually quite related to what Diana was mentioning. I think that the paper that was prepared by Sebastian and team is quite extensive, is quite comprehensive, is clearly showing particularly the cost of the lack of transparency, which is necessary to determine which are the policies that the states have to take. And it's actually part of just the tip of the iceberg, because there are a lot of issues that have not been discussed because they are part of unknown claims. They are part of unknown settlement awards or settlement decisions. And it's also part of this big discussion that is currently being a trend in ISDS reform, which is mediation. Now, mediation has established an architecture of enforcement through the Singapore Convention, by which decisions taken in mediation are enforceable everywhere in the world if a state is party to that particular agreement. But then there is no actual mechanism or principle of transparency. So team was mentioning this on the issue of mediation, and it's actually something that might replicate all the systemic all the systemic issues that currently arbitration is having. And this goes directly with the idea of the legitimacy crisis that ISDS is having, and was the reason of creating the mandate of Working Group 3 in UNCITRAL. One of those issues and legitimacy crisis was more or less linked to transparency, consistency of awards, and efficiency of the system as a whole. But I would say that transparency is not just an issue of the legitimacy problem in ISDS, but it's the cornerstone. And it was the issue that actually brought the discussion to reform ISDS in UNCITRAL. If we see which are one of the concerns, or some of the concerns that countries and developing countries in particular have raised as cross-cutting issues, are those linked particularly to the issue of transparency. We see, for example, the assessment of damages. the lack of knowledge on what is the calculation method that is actually raised during in the paper written by Tim and Sebastian, which is the standard applicable for the calculation of damages in awards. What is the consistency used by tribunals on doing this? How knowing the real number of claims can allow for an early dismissal of frivolous claims raised by investors. So if we don't have all of that data, if we are not able to find that data, although we have some good data, but if we don't have the whole panorama, it's really difficult for starting to discuss these kind of changes. And then we need to have a systemic approach to the reform of ISDS. At the same time, for example, we have the issue of third-party funding, which was raised by Ana Maria, and it's clearly an issue that has to be discussed. And it's not only linked with the lack of transparency in itself, but it's also linked with, for example, the increasing amount of costs that are being awarded in investment decisions, the increasing amount of claims that are being requested, and particularly as well, the amount of frivolous claims that can be actually increased. So we see that these issues are being discussed in UNCITRAL now, are one of the issues that are actually of a concern for developing countries. But also one issue that is raised by Tim and Sebastian, which is necessary to discuss, and we are looking to see more and more about this participation, is the participation of affected communities of third parties in ISDS procedures. The only way to do this is to increase knowledge and increase information and data about the cases that are not only resolved, but are actually being presented, the claims that are starting. The example of Colombia is really good, the way in which Colombia is trying to publicize all of this information so that affected communities know what is the damage that they are going to incur and how their rights are not actually being protected in one way or another, or even harmed by third parties, in this case investors, and allowing their participation in these procedures. Currently, the amount of participation in this procedure is quite limited. One is because there is lack of information about these processes, but also is because there is no knowledge about how the system works. And this drives me to the second, to my other concluding remark, and I think that with this I will try to finish, is that if you don't know the processes, if the process is not known, the details of how the process is actually being managed is not known by the public itself, it's really difficult to actually discuss about the legitimacy of the process. It seems that now the discussion has been limited to policymakers, academic researchers, or public policy researchers. But the public which is being affected doesn't really know what is happening. So it's necessary for people to know what the process is. And there is one interesting study which is currently being made in the United States with regards to mediation, particularly commercial mediation, when they are looking at the need to increase transparency in mediation, because we know that in mediation, the rule, and majority in arbitration as well, the rule is that everything is confidential unless the parties agree to make it transparent. So that is a shift that has to occur, a systemic shift that has to occur, because in this particular element, this particular study, what they are trying to show is that the legitimacy of the process is directly linked to the public knowledge of the process itself. So if people doesn't know what is happening, there is no possibility for the system to have legitimacy, because it's a completely secretive. And this drives me to what Diana was also mentioning. There is a lot of good data, but that data is really good because of the work that UNCTAD has done. So we need that mapping, and I think we need to improve the role that UNCTAD has with regards to not just the mapping of data, but also the possibility of making UNCTAD the forum where we can discuss these issues. I think that role is important and has to be strengthened. Because it goes with what Ana Maria was saying, there is also a need for having certain kind of transparency limitations with regards to how the state will use strategically that defense. But at the same time, that is a process, or that is a problem which is coming from the lack of transparency. If you consider that you have now 100 cases at the same time, you're dealing with different ad hoc tribunals. It's not an institutional tribunal, but ad hoc tribunals, all dealing with different causes that can actually be parallel claims, then the state is obliged, or more or less is really strongly involved with the need to keep information so that they can defend themselves after. But it's not something that you have to push for. It's something that the system is making you do. because there is no systemic approach to resolving the dispute. So all of this makes me more or less go to the final point. We are now having this paper, which is written by Tim and Sebastian, which is quite good. It's giving us just the tip of the iceberg. But now we are dealing with a not known number of cases, which are actually making our life harder, because this is not only not allowing us to have the full imagery of what is happening in ISDS, but it's also pushing for regulatory chill. We don't know how many cases are being or how many claims are being used just to threaten the state, and how many cases have been brought against the state just to reform a particular public measure. So this is really good. Now we are having at least the cost of the lack of transparency or the transparency gap. But now this will allow us to move further. And with this, I finish. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Danielle. A lot to discuss. And by the way, let me also just remind our participants about the questions that they can write out, but also thanks to our panelists and some of my colleagues who've been answering them. So do look at some of those questions. Tim and Sebastian, I wanted to come back to you to see if you have reflections or responses. In particular, a couple questions that I would surface, but then feel free to respond to any of it. When we talked before about your paper, we also talked about the unknown unknowns and how that came up in your research. And so I just wanted to put that back on the table. And if you have any thoughts from your methodology or from your own reflections as to estimating the unknown unknowns. I also wondered, and then Fabian asked a great question that built on my question, is I wondered whether you had any conclusions from whether you could see any trends or conclusions from the missing claims and missing awards. And Fabian asks, building on that, whether the model allows for an estimate of the regional distribution of the missing claims and awards. And so is there something, is there more that you can say about what's missing? So let me maybe pause there for the moment and let Tim and Sebastian respond while also looking at the questions that have been asked.
Sebastian, would you like to speak on the methodology points?
Yes, so there was the question about the regional distribution of missing claims and awards. So that's for sure something that we can do. I don't believe we have that in the paper, but I do recall, I think, looking at that before. And if I remember correctly, the regional distribution for missing claims and awards looked something similar to what I would have assumed. But I'm happy to grab those images and those figures again and send those to you by email if you're interested.
Yeah, we do have some in Annex 1 of the paper, have some regional data. It may or may not directly address your question. So thank you for that, both of you. And to respond to, there's so many good points in the discussion. It's hard to know even where to begin. So thank you for the terrific insights. One broad point that I think is worth underscoring from our angle also is that we don't want to oversimplify transparency. And I think this speaks to some of the comments made throughout the conversation. There's certainly room for nuance around delicate, sensitive situations that sovereigns find themselves in as party to multiple negotiations. We certainly don't want to diminish the existence of exceptional circumstances that would actually better serve public interest if transparency had some discretionary and temporary mechanisms as far as what states are able to exercise. So that point is very well taken. And another thing we would note is that transparency has gotten better since even in just the years we started. That first project I mentioned in the winning and losing in ISDS, until now, until this article that's coming out now that we're talking about today. UNCTAD's websites have gotten much better, state practices, as Director Ordóñez Fuentes explained, state practices have gotten better. And there's still a lot of room for improvement, but we would be remiss if we didn't point out some of that progress and some of those successes alongside the nuance point. So I think that's extremely important. So I'll turn it back to other folks on the panel.
Great, and let me indeed invite our other panelists to share reflections, including on what you've heard, and also looking at some of the good questions that have been asked. Let me maybe pull out a couple from the Q&A. One that Jared asked about the time lag of information and whether that can account for some of the missing cases. I would maybe add to that a question for those thinking about this from a policy and practical perspective, and whether and what the implications are for a time lag in light of states' immediate engagement with the system, both in their defense and in engagement with the negotiation process. And perhaps a related question that I wanted to put back out, maybe especially to Diana and Danielle, but would invite anyone to respond, is that in filling this transparency gap, as Tim mentioned, there's improvement, but how should we think differently about information that's becoming available because of efforts like Ana Maria mentioned, of states that are providing this information versus more institutional mandates, and how that might affect not only the speed with which the transparency gap is filled or addressed, but also how that might affect the information that's actually being made available. So let me, and actually, sorry, I will pull out one more question if from the Q&A, if for those who would like to think about it, is how AI may affect all of this, and whether there's the possibility of using artificial intelligence to perhaps fill some of those gaps. But there's also a question about whether other forms of technological innovation are actually going to exacerbate some of the privacy challenges. So I hope I've done justice to some of those excellent questions in the Q&A. Let me turn back to the panelists and see if you, with limited time, have thoughts on those or concluding thoughts. Ana Maria, can I go back in the same order, especially seeing our limited time, and invite you to respond to any of that, but also offer any concluding thoughts that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think that states are the ones responsible. States should be conscious of the importance of being transparent and public, and not allowing investors and some other actors from the system to keep controlling the information, because there are several reasons for doing that. One of them has not been discussed within this panel, but it's also to limit the access of actors to the system, and that should also be addressed. States should not enter into that, and states should try and promote as much as possible, make the information available to the public, being obviously conscious about strategic considerations. But I think that states nowadays have the tools to do that, even if the treaties that are the ones that serve as the base for several claims do not contemplate transparency.
Thank you. Diana?
I see a lot of questions in the Q&A on ICSID and unknown cases. And I would just like to specify, so cases outside of ICSID are those brought under the arbitration rules of UNCITRAL or the Stockholm Chamber of Commerce or the International Chamber of Commerce. And aside from UNCITRAL, the other arbitration rules, the default rule there is confidentiality. So it's really difficult to identify these cases. There is no registry. This is why it's so hard to estimate how many we are actually missing. They kind of trickle in over the years, some of them, but we just cannot put a number to it. For instance, we can report based on everything what we have found, publicly available information a year. We say there were 70 cases at the end of the year. And then 3 years later, we know there were 90 cases, and these 20 cases that were added on are cases that were outside of ICSID. And we simply cannot know how many more will be there. So it's really very difficult. And just one more word, this is a systemic structural issue, right? So there have been efforts, the ICSID amendments, but also very important, the Anti-Trial Transparency Rules and the Anti-Trial Transparency Convention. And they have not yet been that important and that successful in bringing about transparency because of the number of ratifications, but also the fact that a lot of cases are brought based on old treaties. And even new rules will not make appear the missing cases from previous years, right? So it's really very difficult. I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. It's quite complicated.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I just want to finish with really quickly with two things. One is that the idea of ISDS was, the purpose of it at the beginning at least, was to establish a mechanism of good governance and the protection of the rights of investors in general through the rule of law. So the idea was at the end promoting the rule of law. So it's inconsistent with that particular principle that you would like to promote the rule of law in one way, but actually limiting transparency, which is the basis of the rule of law and good governance. So it's necessary to put both of them together. That's the one thing. And the second thing with regards to artificial intelligence, is a vicious cycle. If you don't have data to feed the artificial intelligence cannot do anything. So the purposes of artificial intelligence will serve only as much as we have data to actually provide to artificial intelligence. So the lack of transparency is also affecting all the possibilities of knowing more and using that information to prevent or to use in this kind of strategic litigation. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you so much. As I feared, an hour with all of you went far too quickly, but I trust that we will continue these conversations offline and wanted to thank all of you. I wanted to try to distill 3 buckets of conversations, which I know will continue with all of you. One is the practical conclusions and the considerations of the transparency gap, especially for states' legal defense and their engagement with reform processes, and how to and the implications of those conclusions, as well as trying to fill the information that we don't know. A second is the institutional imperatives with respect to closing the gap and addressing the legitimacy of the system. And that very much points to ICSID and UNCITRAL and other institutional mandates and the importance of their addressing transparency in the system. And then the third huge bucket is looking at the policy conclusions and considerations from this systemic challenge, including how the systemic challenge sheds light on the issues that are at the forefront of reform processes, as well as how they should inform the design of those reform processes and also of other alternatives to ISDS, including mediation, which risks having many of the same systemic challenges. So Sebastian and Tim, as you can see, what you've seeded here and the information that you've provided is such an important input to these ongoing processes, to states' engagement with the system, to the ongoing reform processes, and to all of our efforts to align investment governance with states' objectives and development goals. So let me thank you so much, especially for your contribution to our work and to our understanding of the system, for sharing your paper and your findings with us today, to Danielle and Diana and to Ana Maria for your time in helping to discuss the implications from respective perspectives, to all of the panelists for the excellent questions. And let me please ask all of you to help us continue the discussion of these important findings by staying in touch with all of us and continuing to share your observations so that we can work collectively to address the challenges identified. So thank you to Carlos also for your continued leadership of work in this area and for being with us. And thanks to all of you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Bye-bye.